Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're opening up a conversation about something really fundamental, a kind of painful paradox, right at the heart of the helping professions. I mean, think about social work. It's built on these ideals, right? Empathy, equity, fighting injustice. But the way people actually get into the profession, the licensure exam, well, it seems like it's almost structurally designed to exclude some of the very minds best suited for it. Let's get into this.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and there's some really solid research confirming this tension now. We're digging into the findings from a 2024 study by Torres, McGuire, and Kogan. They looked at the ASWB exam, that's the Association of Social Work Boards, and they did this big survey, found something pretty defining. Almost 30% of the people taking that exam identified as neurodivergent.
30%. Wow. I mean, in the general population, the diagnosed rate is, what, much lower than that? That's a huge concentration.
It is huge.
Yeah.
But, the researcher said it felt so right to them. And if you think about why, well, it makes sense. Neurodivergent people, they've often, lived inside systems of misunderstanding, as the source puts it. They spent their lives sort of translating, figuring out unspoken rules, developing these really sharp skills for navigating, frankly, broken structures. So it tracks that they'd gravitate towards work that aims to understand those systems and offer real empathy.
Right. So the people who deeply understand broken systems are drawn to fixing them. Makes perfect sense. But then our sources describe the gates to the profession. They say they're built in the image of those already safe inside, forcing candidates, including, many neurodivergent and racialized folks, to basically contort their minds until they fit the keyhole. So our mission today is really to unpack how this exam functions as behavioral conditioning and look at the harm caused by pushing this monocognitive ideal.
Exactly. We're diving into how this gatekeeping seems to value one very specific, kind of linear way of thinking, and how it often penalizes the more associative, intuitive, maybe gestalt ways of thinking that many neurodivergent and other marginalized candidates bring.
Okay, and we really have to start with maybe the most powerful quote from the study, the one that gives it its title. I was told to think like a middle-aged white woman. I mean, it's so direct. It really lays bare that demand for conformity.
Yeah, and the sources make it clear this wasn't some metaphor. It was literal advice given to a student. It wasn't just about understanding policy. It was, here's how you guess the intended answer. Adopt this specific perspective. It basically exposes the test as requiring a performance, not really measuring competence objectively.
And that specific perspective points right to the numbers, doesn't it? The quantitative data on who gets through the gate. What did the study find about racial disparities?
Oh, the disparities were stark, really stark. White candidates passed on the first try almost 96% of the time. But for Black and Latinx test takers, those rates just fell sharply. It showed a really clear cognitive and racial barrier.
Okay, so nearly everyone in one group gets through, but steep drop-offs for others. How did the researchers connect the exam's design to that outcome, to race and culture?
Well, they looked closely at the language, the phrasing, even the pacing. The argument is that the exam's whole setup, its language, its tempo, the assumptions baked into the questions, it's calibrated for one specific demographic mind. It rewards a very particular linear reasoning style and a kind of cultural fluency that's really shaped by whiteness and middle-class expectation. So if your background is different, or if your idea of best practice comes more from community wisdom than, say, the exact protocols of a certain type of agency, you're already at a disadvantage.
You're being judged against a baseline you might not even share.
Exactly.
And this feels important how the researchers approach this. They didn't treat things like neurodivergence or race as, confounding variables, things messing up the neat data. Instead, they treated the examinees' voices, their identities, as contexts of meaning, as truth-bearing data.
Yes, that's a crucial methodological shift.
Yeah.
Acknowledging that lived experience is the data here. It's key to understanding the barrier.
Right. And that lets us pivot, like you said earlier, from who gets excluded to how they get excluded.
Yeah.
The exam looks like a knowledge test, right? But the sources argue it functions more like behavioral conditioning.
Yeah, a machinery of conformity disguised as merit. That's the phrase they use.
So it's not just, do you know the rules? It's more like, do you think about the rules in the approved way, especially under pressure?
Rewarding a certain kind of compliance. Precisely. It demands a specific thought process. Often the neatest, textbook perfect one. It measures how well you can replicate what they call the authorized logic of empathy. And crucially, it seems to reward detached concern and procedural kindness. The source calls it the clean empathy of policy.
Clean empathy. Can you maybe give an example? What does that look like on the test versus the kind of empathy that might get marked wrong, the too embodied kind?
Okay, sure. Imagine a question where a client is, like, really distressed. Maybe they were denied a crucial service. The detached concern answer, the one the test likely wants, probably involved immediately thinking about, say, mandatory reporting rules, setting boundaries, referencing policy codes, following procedure first.
Right, the administrative steps.
Exactly.
Right.
Stabilize through procedure. But the more embodied empathy response, that might prioritize validating the client's feelings first, spending time building rapport, maybe immediately starting to advocate fiercely for that denied service.
Yeah.
Now, a good social worker might do that, but the test could mark it wrong because it's too relational, or maybe deviates from the required policy sequence. It's seen as messy.
Okay, yeah, I see the difference, and that really highlights the conflict, especially for that 30% who identify as neurodivergent. The test format itself, multiple choice, seems to favor what the sources call the Chomskyan mind.
Right, sort of analytic linear model, thinking towards one single verifiable answer, perfect for multiple choice.
But that's a trap for what they call Gestalt processors, isn't it? People who think differently.
Absolutely, a trap. Gestalt processors, they often think in constellations rather than syllogisms. They excel at seeing connections, the bigger picture, the systemic patterns, context. They hold complexity.
So if I'm a Gestalt thinker, faced with that multiple choice policy question, what happens in my brain? The linear thinker just picks the first step, but
You likely see all the potential consequences. Where the test wants step A, your brain immediately sees how step A, without step C or D for context, could cause harm down the line. Your strength, that associative reasoning, that contextual awareness that makes you brilliant in actual practice at seeing human complexity, it becomes a liability on the test.
it punishes you for seeing the nuance.
Exactly. The test demands you flatten that richness into the single correct procedural answer.
And that lands us right back at that really cruel irony we mentioned at the start. The very skills honed by navigating difficult systems, the cognitive traits that make neurodivergent people potentially fantastic social workers, they become liabilities under examination.
Yeah. The system says it wants empathy, but it penalizes cognitive difference.
So what's the cost of that beyond just failing an exam?
Well, the systemic harm is significant. Passing, for many, demands mimicry. And the sources say the cost is fluency in self-erasure. To get that credential, you have to perform this required cognitive style, even if it's totally counter to how you naturally understand people and problems.
Wow. Fluency in self-erasure. When you have to unlearn your own way of thinking to fit in, it stops feeling like a professional standard and starts feeling more like what the sources call ideological hygiene.
That's the exact term they use, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a filtering process. It sets up this hierarchy of minds. Analytic is better than intuitive, verbal better than sensory, and it effectively filters out, the fiery, the nonlinear, the radical. It kind of ensures people entering the field are, well, domesticated, procedurally compliant.
And this isn't happening in isolation, right? The researchers connect this specific gatekeeping in social work to sort of broader trends.
They do. They draw a line between this impulse to enforce one right way of thinking and licensure and other things we see happening institutionally. Like, for instance, the defunding of things like theater programs or certain diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives.
Okay, let's just clarify that for listeners. When we talk about DEI, we mean programs aimed at making sure organizations like universities or companies actively support and include people from marginalized groups, correct?
Correct. And the sources suggest that the pushback against those programs and the rigidity of this exam, they stem from a similar place. They see both as acts of containment, a kind of backlash against pluralism itself.
The system saying, we only want one approved way to think, one approved way to care.
Yeah, basically managing the economy of empathy, as one source puts it, deciding who gets paid to provide care and maybe who has to do it unpaid.
And enforcing this monocognitive ideal.
Right, and it demands this systematic unlearning of feeling and practice. The source uses this really striking term, state-sponsored alexithymia.
Okay, that's a clinical term, alexithymia. Can you break that down in this context?
Sure. Alexithymia basically is difficulty identifying and describing emotions in yourself or others. So state-sponsored here means the system itself trains you out of connecting deep feeling with professional action. It rewards people who can detach from the human consequences of policy, maintain that professional cool, that procedural focus, even when the human cost is high. Credentialing ends up managing who gets to translate human pain into professional structures, and it selects for those who can do it coolly, linearly.
That's quite an indictment. It suggests the system is more about protecting its own structures than protecting the public, or even measuring competence effectively. So if the current gate protects hierarchy, not people, what would an inclusive profession look like? If we let go of this idea that there's only a single right way to know, how could we reimagine that gate?
Well, the study doesn't just diagnose the problem, it offers solutions. They center around this idea of universal design for licensure. The core idea is shifting assessment. Measure competence through multiple pathways that actually look like real-world social work, instead of these abstract, timed tests that just reward speed and replicating procedures.
Okay, so moving away from just testing recall towards testing, like actual capacity for handling complexity, for relationship.
The researchers suggest concrete alternatives, like maybe oral exams for people who communicate best that way in real-time interaction, or written narratives for people who think in story. Let them analyze a complex case by tracing all the context, the history, the relationships involved.
Oh, that immediately validates that Gestalt thinking, right? Seeing the whole picture, not just the isolated problem.
Precisely. And crucially, the whole process needs to slow down. If competence is the goal, not just processing speed, then allow time for deep reflection. Don't punish it. Pattern-based reasoning, the Gestalt ability to see the system, should be seen as depth, not a mistake.
What about moving beyond testing altogether? Could we measure competence out in the community?
Yeah, the sources definitely push for that. Alternative assessments like building a portfolio of your actual community practice. That could include peer evaluations, evidence of successful client work over time, maybe even things co-created with community members.
Oh.
Testimonials.
Okay, so that completely flips the script. You're not measuring conformity to procedure anymore. You're measuring capacity for solidarity.
That's the goal, yes. Measuring the ability to actually use that rich, nuanced, associative thinking. The very skills neurodivergent and racialized candidates often bring in effective ethical practice. Because the current system, it protects this illusion that the system already knows what care should look like. It guards its own structure instead of embracing the diversity needed to actually serve a diverse public.
So, this deep dive really underscores that when the gates are built too narrow, when they exclude the very minds often most capable of deep empathy, that 30% neurodivergent group, the racialized candidates facing sharp drop-offs, the profession itself risks becoming just a performance. A sterile imitation of care, not the real thing. We have to recognize that genuine care has to be plural. It can't be domesticated into one right answer on a multiple-choice test.
Absolutely. And that really leaves us with this final thought from the sources, which feels incredibly important. The right kind of mind is not the one that passes the test. It is the one that keeps the world capable of love. If social work truly aims to dismantle systemic injustice, it has to start by not replicating those same exclusionary systems within its own walls.